everyone. Dumelang Sawubona. Welcome to Mr. Mike Teke, our Chair of Council, to our VC, to the members of the MEC and LG, to our staff, students, and friends of UJ. My name is Maria Frahm-Arp, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Library at the University of Johannesburg. And on behalf of the library, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Mike Teke, our UJ Chair of Council, who will be taking us through this reading group session. These are Mr. Teke's sessions, which he began last year. And in each one of the sessions, he has been looking at a book that is both inspirational and informative. In the different series that he's done with us up till now, he has brought his own particular insights to these books. And so today we are looking at Character Building by Booker T. Washington. And I'm sure that once again, it is going to be a very inspirational hour. Mr. Teke is going to begin by giving us some of his reflections, and then we're going to open the floor to questions and answers. We encourage you, please, to put your questions in the Q&A, and you don't have to wait until the end. You can post your questions as they come to you, and in the second half of the session, we'll get to all the questions. So, Mr. Teke, once again, a warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody who's online or who's joining us, and thanks to the university for allowing me this platform to participate on these book reviews. And today's book that I'm talking about is Character Building by Booker T. Washington. Quite a number of people will look at this book and say, why are you reviewing a book that was published in 1902 and published again in 2013? There was a reason probably for that, because the book, in my view, it's a great book. It will assist quite a number of young people who are growing up, who are building careers, or who are trying to shape their lives and grow up to be upstanding citizens of this world. The book published in 1902, the person who authored the book is Booker T. Washington. He passed away at the age of 59. This young man, I call him young man because he died early. He was born into slavery in the United States of America, and he wrote 14 books. He authored 14 books. And this is the book that I selected to read simply because of its nature in terms of character building and the ability to assist the ability to assist young people to be shaped to be better citizens. When I selected this book, it's because I realized that I help a lot of young people who come to me and say they'd love to be mentored. And they come in different stances. Some of them would say they would make appointments and see me all the time. They are dedicated, they are committed. Every month I would see them. And we'll talk about their lives, how to make their lives better and how to make their lives wholesome, and to improve those lives, their lifestyles, and what they want to achieve in life. And I come across some of those who want to be mentored, and most of them are those who just talk about mentoring and then they disappear. I don't know what happens to them. And I've got a few nuggets who are great success stories, and I'm proud of those young people. So Booker T. Washington talks about character building. In a book that was authored by him amongst the 14, and Booker T. Washington grew up in Alabama and Tuskegee, and the institute that he ran or he led from the age of 25 until he passed on was called Tuskegee University or Tuskegee Institute. And this institute's focused on three main areas. Along the lines of labor, that's what the curriculum was centered around. Number two, the curriculum was centered around academic training. And number three, moral and religious training. And Booker T. Washington made it his responsibility every Sunday evening. He would lecture the students, he would give a speech And this book is based on those 37 chapters on all the areas Booker T. Washington touched on every Sunday evening, talking to the learners or the students at Tuskegee University. Firstly, the impressions you have of this man, he was larger than life in that he was respected, he was trusted, people believed in him. But before we go deeper into the books, there are two stories that I want to relate first. The first one is about him and his relationship with a gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. In the USA, in the racial politics of the US those years, those names, amongst others, were prominent. Booker T. Washington used to refer to the Southern people. He came from the South, and W.E.B. Du Bois came from the North. And there was somewhat of a conflict and competition between the two of them. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that Booker T. Washington was more of an accommodating person. He was an accommodationist. And he called him that because he believed that he was very accommodating to the other racial group, which was whites, because being Black, coming from slavery, he should have taken a different stance the way he fought about the rights of Black people in the United States of America. And W.E.B. Du Bois had a different view of that. He wanted more. He wanted voting rights. He wanted other things beyond what Booker T. Washington. He felt that Booker T. Washington didn't go too far to talk about the issues Black people were grappling with. Now, if you read the book, the first part of the book, they say the life of Booker T. Washington cannot be written. No human being can know its deep and beneficent influence, and no pen can describe it. Now, the popular speech that he made in Atlanta, they call it the Atlanta Exposition. One farmer, and I'd like to quote that farmer, he said to him when he was going to do the Atlanta Exposition address in 1893, he said, "Washington, you have spoken before the northern white people, the Negroes are in the South, and to us country white people in the South. But in Atlanta tomorrow, you will have before you the northern whites, the southern whites, and the Negroes all together. I am afraid that you have got yourself into a tight place." What he was trying to say is that Booker T. Washington had a perception or a proper perspective of the people he was addressing wherever he went. The second story I want to relate to, other than his relationship with W.E.B. Du Bois and the northern people, because he was coming from the South, is a story that relates to South Africa. In South Africa, the first president of the African National Congress was Dr. John Langalibalele Dube, who was influenced and inspired by Booker T. Washington, especially Tuskegee Institute or the University Tuskegee. And when he came back to Natal, having studied in the US, he started a school in Natal called Ohlange. And that's why in 1994, our president, President Nelson Mandela, the first voting station he used when he voted at Ohlange, because that's where John Langalibalele Dube was based, and he started his school, being inspired by a person like Booker T. Washington, amongst others. He was an author. I'm talking about Booker T. Washington. He was an orator. He was an advisor to two US presidents. During those years, 1901, those years, in President Roosevelt and President Taft were used him as their advisor, Booker T. Washington. Every evening on a Sunday, Booker T. Washington will have a lesson for him. And the other important thing, at the age of 25, it's when he became the head of this institute called Tuskegee. I remember years back, there were two universities I used to talk about, one in Atlanta, one in Alabama, and one of them was Tuskegee, saying that it was mostly Black and it will be an inspiration if one were to study at such an institution. And I think most of the youngsters we have who may be listening, think about those two universities. I know some of the people who would end up being Rhodes Scholars. And Ivy League institutions, but these two play a significant role in giving you a view of the type of person this was. Now, being an author of 14 books, one of them being this one that we're talking about, and having spoken about the curriculum, I am encouraging young people to read these 37 chapters on this book called Character Building. I'm encouraging you to look at studying
the annual policy schedule, the renewal of policies, and those that were up for.
Marwala, please ask your friend to mute. Are we okay? Can I go ahead? Okay, thank you. So the book Character Building has got 38 chapters. Has 37 chapters, but before then you've got a preface and an introduction. And I'd like for us to benefit out of this book, I'd like to identify several chapters that touched me and the lessons that come out of these lessons, out of these chapters that are still pertinent in our lives in 2021 and are still going to be important in 2050 for the younger generation who are coming on. And that is why when I mentor young people, I use such examples. And I'm going to start hand-picking chapters. There's a chapter that I like called chapter 22. It's an interesting chapter. It made me laugh. It's called Some Great Little Things. In this chapter, Booker T. Washington, he talks about great little things as those things that are regarded as small and unimportant. He says these things are small, they are unimportant, but they are great little things. He refers to what the chaplain at the school at Tuskegee had mentioned as physical, mental, and spiritual parts, and these small little things were of a physical nature. When the chaplain spoke about the three parts, namely the physical, mental, and the spiritual, these little things focus on the physical. And you can't guess them if you haven't read the book, but they are so small, but for me, they are important, and I'll share why I picked this chapter as one chapter that struck me, and I use it a lot for young people. He said, if you are going to be taken seriously in this world, you must regularly and systematically bathe, wash, be proper, and be clean. Wash yourself properly. Somebody who's not hygienic, who doesn't take a bath, is not going to be taken seriously in this world. That's number one. I know a lot of people will take that for granted, but you know very well if you sit in a meeting, whether in a board meeting or you're lecturing in a class as a teacher or a lecturer, or you engage people in any organization or any craft that you're involved in, if you're not hygienic, if you're not clean, something is going to be questioned about it. I remember one of the richest people in the world, I won't mention his name. When you read his book, one of the things people picked up about him, that was the fact that he never liked to wash. And people never liked that idea, and they don't forget that about that small little thing. The second one is about the matter of teeth, brushing your teeth. That's what Booker T. Washington was talking about in this chapter. He talks about some great little things. He says, brush your teeth, be clean, be hygienic. The third one, he talks about the matter of your hair. And then he talks about polishing your shoes. I'm not sure whether it applies to females, but mostly us men have to polish our shoes and look clean and look presentable. And that's the start. Having looked at a lot of chapters, and in this book, as I said, there are 37 chapters. I picked chapter 22 because normally when I start talking to young people and I mentor them, the first thing I talk to them about is exactly that you must be hygienic, you must be clean, you must look after yourself. When you present yourself in front of people, nobody must, because some of those things are not forgettable. And probably nobody would want to marry you or engage you. Not that I've said everybody should get married, but I'm saying anybody who wants to be your friend will look at such things as basic little things. The second chapter that I've handpicked that Booker T. Washington talks about is chapter 26. He talks about individual responsibility. Said one's responsibility to others is one great habit to possess. And happy and success people have this in abundance. He talks about individual responsibility as in you have a feeling that you are responsible for others. You have a feeling that you want to support others. You have a feeling that you feel good by assisting others. You have a feeling that all the time you are willing to be there, take responsibility for things. And probably at the end of the book, I will talk more about individual responsibility, but that's a chapter that played an important role as well, left an important mark in what Booker T. Washington talks about. The third chapter is a chapter called chapter 31, where he talks about substance versus shadow. He says, why should we live superficial lives where people who live a shadow life of living beyond their means? Why, if you cannot afford something, you force yourself to buy it? And he makes an example of a wedding where somebody at those years in 1901, somebody would pay $450 for a wedding instead of having a cheaper wedding and making sure that you save money for other things that are important. And I have seen in our lives, the young people we are raising today, I have seen the young people I'm mentoring today. Most of them will never tell you about owning a home or buying a house for themselves first. They'd rather buy an expensive car and live at home with their parents. And Booker T. Washington differentiates between what he calls substance and shadow. Says you're living in the shadow of what you shouldn't be. Because you tell the world and you believe that in this world, you will be seen, you're looking better, you're looking smarter. And in his conversation about these chapters, he keeps on referring to the southern people and the north. When I leave the southern side and go to New York, this is what I observe, this is what I see, this is what I realize with people. And I know quite a number of people take exception. If you were to read this book, you will see some racial tensions with it, where he talks about us colored people. When he says us colored people, presumably he's referring to us Black Americans, where he was referring to if they own a business, if they own some small business, they must handle it professionally and make sure that it looks better, it looks clean, it looks hygienic, it looks professional, and everybody wants to go into that business. But this chapter, then he talks about substance and shadow. It says we're living beyond our means. We're living a lie. We're not living the truth. And that is why there's no substance. You're living, it's a shadow. It's the shadow of what should be real. And I found that lesson, having taken the first one, talking about some great little things that become very personal when I discuss with young people, when they come to my office and we come and talk about mentoring and say, the first thing that I want to see from you, are you required in your job to wear a suit and a tie, as an example? Are you required in your role to be having polished shoes, or you can wear sneakers and a suit? Again, ladies and gentlemen, I am not dictating to people that they shouldn't have any type of hair, but it must be hygienic. It must be clean. The second part is about individual responsibility, supporting others. The third one that we're talking about, it's the one where he talks about substance and shadow. The fourth chapter that played an important role for me is chapter 3. Booker T. Washington talks about some of the rocks ahead. Says when we grow up, we are exposed to life, and life, you will face difficulties in life. There will be days of difficulties. There will be days of discouragement, and there will be rainy days. These difficulties and challenges make you strong and build your character. He stresses these issues hard. And the point I'm making, ladies and gentlemen, is that I think of our students at university. And I reflect on this and say, when a young student arrives in a room and finds that the room is not equipped like their bedroom at home, as an example, it becomes a big issue instead of saying, let me overcome this difficulty and move on in life. Not that I want you to be abused, not that I want you to sleep in unhygienic rooms. He talks about if you face difficulties in class and the subject is difficult or the work is difficult and you have to compete with other people, ladies and gentlemen, he says, There will be difficulties. You are going to find it difficult. This road is not going to be easy. It's going to be rocky. And Booker T. Washington encourages us, therefore, to prepare ourselves. Can you imagine if this, having written this book in 1901, today we reflect on these issues and we do face obstacles, we do face difficulties, we do face challenges. And he says, some of the rocks ahead, you are going to come across them. When you arrive at Tuskegee, you arrive there, you find a place to stay, you find a place to sleep. If you find that the room is not suited to your conditions, you find that the food is not great, if you find that people are dressed better than you, you must know that you will face those difficulties. The mindset you should develop is the mindset to defeat those difficulties. And that builds character. That makes you stronger. And therefore, when I was reading this book, I was reflecting on my life as a young kid at home. And I remember we came across a lot of hard things. And now as an adult operating businesses, I've recently faced quite a lot of rocks on my road. And I've always said, I will overcome these. And that's what I encourage young people when I mentor them and say, these are small things. Because young people at the age of 29, 30, 31, when they face career issues, they start to say, I will resign and go to another job. And my story, therefore, at times I say to young people, if you resign and your boss is a difficult boss, you must know that where you are applying, you're going to find a boss who is more difficult than this one. And hence, for people to own their own freedom, that is why then comes the issue of individual responsibility. I am not going to be trapped in talking about jobs only, because we are developing young people who are not going only to be job seekers, but they are going to be job creators as well. Young entrepreneurs who are going to come across these rocks ahead, and we need to prepare you to be ready. The fifth chapter that Booker T. Washington talks about, it's chapter 5, virtue of simplicity. So I'll dwell more on this. I'll take a longer time on this. You know, the virtue of simplicity. We run a business called Seriti Resources. Our businesses here, where I work, there are 3 principles we drive. It's called simplicity, intensity, and consistency. And it's interesting that Booker T. Washington in 1901 talks about the virtue of simplicity. And let me share this with you. He says, as we build things, we must not be injured by success. We must look for opportunities to stretch our dollar, but don't complicate your life. And here's my story about simplicity. In my life, a simple business is understood by everyone. A complex business, even the owners don't understand. So Booker T. Washington, when he talks about simplicity, then I'm reflecting on another book. There's a book that's available. It came out recently, not in 1901, 2021. It's a book called Dream Big. I think they say Sono Grande. This book is authored by Christian Corrier. And Christian Corrier talks about 3 individuals. These 3 individuals, namely Jorge Paul Lehman, Marcel Telles, and Beto Sikupira. These 3 individuals are the guys who own a company called 3G Capital. 3G Capital are the owners of a company called Anheuser-Busch, a company that bought South African breweries in South Africa, globally. The second company they own is Heinz, and the third one is Burger King. They turned these businesses around. And why? Because they thrive on simplicity. And let me read this from their book, and I'm aligning it to character building and simplicity. They say the founders exemplify simplicity. They have very simple dress code. You would not notice them in a crowd. They kept simple offices, never walling themselves off their people and staying in an executive suite. They use their increasing wealth, not for opulence, but to simplify their lives. So they would focus on continuing to build the company. That is 3G Capital. I learned that the best sign of true wealth is an uncluttered calendar with time available to focus on the most important priorities. And their entire strategy is so simple. Great people, give them big things to do, and sustain a meritocratic ownership culture. That's essentially it. No more complicated than that. True genius is not making an idea complex, but just the opposite, simplifying a complex world into a very simple idea and holding to it for a very long time. Now, if this book published now about 3G Capital talking about simplicity, they call this section Simplicity Has Genius and Magic in It. Now, Booker T. Washington in Character Building, 1901, spoke about the virtue of simplicity, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm saying, try and simplify life, don't make it complex. If you pray to gods, try and make a simple one. If you've got 15 cars, probably you'll have to simplify because you can't drive 15 cars at the same time. If you run a business, try and simplify your life, probably by being accessible. There are quite a number of examples, and I don't want to complicate this discussion and then lose you in this whole story. So that chapter 5, I'd like you to read it when you read this book and put it on your pocket and use it all the time. I'd like to talk to you about the 6th chapter that played an important role in my life, and I appreciated that very much. It's chapter 29 of the book. It talks about what would your father and your mother say? What would father and mother say? That's Booker T. Washington asking that question. He says, our parents are proud of us, and the key question often asked is, what would my father or mother think of this? If you're sitting alone at Tuskegee in Alabama at the university, at the institute, he says to the students and the learners, what would my father or mother think of this? Whatever you're busy doing, would they approve, or should I be ashamed that I have done this thing? How do I instill a sense of pride in my parents, my father, and my mother? Booker T. Washington says, we can train your hands and fill your hands with knowledge. But if your character is flawed and are not upright in character and have no true heart, you are no better off than the ignorant. The importance of us growing up and mentoring young people. Some of the young people we mentor today are the young people whose parents effectively are not there. Maybe they passed away, maybe they are neglecting them, maybe there's no relationship. But I think of my life when I was still at university that I never had parents, but you do reflect that the people you left back at home are very important to you. And Booker T. Washington then talks about 2 big lessons, ladies and gentlemen. And these 2 big lessons in the last chapter, but it's not the end of my conversation. I just picked the last chapter. It's a painful chapter. It's called The Last Words. And then I'll go back to the discussion and talk more about the book. Booker T. Washington talks about, in his last words, it was probably the last session. It was the end of the year at Tuskegee. He says to the students, when you go back home, don't ever go back home with the notion that you are far better than the people in your neighborhood. In other words, we go back home, we leave university, it's after the first day, it's after the second year, it's after the third year, or completing or not completing. Suddenly you think the people you come from or the village you come from, you look down upon those people because they are no more better, or they are not better than you because you come from Tuskegee. And he cautions the young students. And today, I look back at that and say, young students will turn around and say, I'm not going back home. What I mean by that, if a student is at UJ and the school, then we have recess or holidays, then the students say, I'm not going back home, either to a rural area, because those people are not better off. They are not better than me. I'm better now. And if you were warned in 1901 by Booker T. Washington, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we need to be talking to our students that it's when you instill a sense of pride, that go back to the village where you know that your neighborhood is looking at you. They're waiting for you to come and instill that spirit of confidence to the youngsters and tell them that I'm a student at University of Johannesburg or any other university. And these things are possible whether you come from any rural area or rural establishment or a poor family. He then further says in that last chapter, don't be ashamed of your parents because you think they don't know more than you think you know. Maybe you come from a family of your parents never had the privilege of going to school. But the best price your parents had put on their table was to say, if we didn't have the best education ourselves, this person, this young man, this young little lady must go to school, we'll give her the best education. If you grew up in, Prof. Marwala comes from Venda, and I'm sure he never went back to Venda and told people that I'm better than you guys because I studied in the United States of America. He went back as an inspiration. He went back and young people were looked up to him and say, Prof. Marwala, we want to be like Chilidzi, the son of Alpheus. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to proceed and talk to you about page 144. When you get this book one day, you will read this section. This book talks about one day this spring, after it had got late in the season so that it was not as a general thing necessary to have fires to heat our buildings. A student was passing a hall called Phelps Hall. He noticed that there was a volume of black smoke pouring out of one of the chimneys there. Some boys might not have noticed the chimney or the smoke at all. Others noticed it. Still others have said that it was none of their business anyway and went away. This boy was different. He noticed the smoke, and although he saw or thought he saw that it came from the chimney, and in saw was probably no sign of harm, he felt that any smoke at all there at that time was such an unusual thing that it ought to be investigated, for fear it might mean danger to the building. He was not satisfied until he had gone into the building and had inspected every floor to clear up to the attic, to see that the chimney and the building were not in danger. As it happened, the janitor had built a fire in the furnace in the basement for some reason, so that the young man's anxiety fortunately was unfounded, but I'm heartily glad he had such an anxiety and that he could not rest until he found out whether there was any foundation for it or not. Now, we frequently hear the word lucky. Oh, you lucky, fortunate. And Booker T. Washington says, it's used with reference to a man's life. Two boys start out in the world at the same time, have the same amount of education. When 20 years later has passed, we find that one of them is wealthy and independent. We find him a successful professional man with an assured reputation, or perhaps at the head of a large commercial establishment, employing many men, or perhaps a farmer owning and cultivating hundreds of acres of land. We find the second boy grown up is now a man, working for perhaps $1 or $1.50 a day, and living from hand to mouth in a rented house. When we remember that the boys started in life equal, we may be tempted to remark that the first boy had been fortunate. That fortune has smiled on him, and that the second has been unfortunate. Booker T. Washington further says, there is no such he ought to do. He did it, and he kept rising from one position to another until he became independent. The second boy was paid to do. He was afraid that he would give 50 cents worth of labor for 25 cents. He watched the clock for fear that he would work 1 minute past 12 o'clock at noon and past 6 o'clock at night. He did not feel that he had any responsibility to look out for his employer's interests. The first boy did $1 worth of work for 50 cents. He was always ready to be at the store before time. And then when the bell rang to stop work, he would go to his employer and ask him if there was not something more that he ought to be done the night before he went home. It was this quality in the first boy that made him valuable and caused him to rise. Why should we call him fortunate or lucky? I think it would be much more suitable to say he is just responsible. Ladies and gentlemen, Booker T. Washington was a slave. Booker T. Washington was not despising the people in the North. Booker T. Washington, he used to go to the North frequently. He visited the North. He wanted to make the people in the South better. Agriculture, people working with their hands. But again, he never made Black people subservient. No, he said, work with your hands, be independent, believe in yourselves. But at the end of the day, there are those who will be job seekers, there are those who will be job creators, or who will make jobs for other people. And you'll read this book, you'll pick up small lessons about owning a home, keeping it clean, painting it, and making sure that you own a piece of land for yourself. And for him, character building related not only to those material things, but the emotional things, dignity, and being able to be a strong character, an upstanding character, respected in your community. And my message to the young people today, if you read this book, published in 1901, you'll realize that there are 37 beautiful chapters that teach you basic things, teach you things that you've neglected. I mentor a young gentleman, ladies and gentlemen, he works in a bank. And during COVID-19, he stopped wearing suits and ties. And one day he came to me and said, are you offended that I come to the meetings not wearing a suit and a tie? And I said, no, as long as you're hygienic, as long as you're clean, as long as you properly washed, took a bath, you brushed your teeth, and your shoes are polished. If you're wearing sneakers, they must be clean. And we need young people like those. I know some people would say it's boring, but I've seen it. It pays. Ladies and gentlemen, can I pause there and take some questions?
Mr. Teke, thank you so much. That was really inspiring and it has sparked several questions. But I want to just begin by reading a comment from one of the students. Thank you so much, Mr. Teke, for selecting this book. It was inspiring, easy to read, and thought-provoking. I think that really sums up Booker T. Washington's ideas and the way that he wrote. So really lovely. I'm going to go to the questions now, and we've got a variety of different questions. The first one is, what is the relationship between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois teach us about politics and, the politics of factions that are rife in South Africa today?
You know, it's a good question in that I reflected on this and I said, had W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington collaborated and worked together for a long time, probably the destination we've arrived at today in the US, they would have arrived long time ago. The point I was making, they probably would have had a Black president years back. We know that there was a time when a person like the late John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, had a fight or had to compete with another Black civil rights leader for a position in Congress. It led to those factions. In South Africa, the lessons that I've learned is that the power of collaboration is important. We remember in 1994, pre-1994, a lot of people used to talk about the ANC and the PAC and other organizations like IFP and the like. And I found that what lessons do we learn? The lessons of collaborating and building things together. And I believe people who compete are those who are in business. Because in business, then you find that it's money that changes hands. And we talk about monopolies and oligopolies and duopolies and the like. In politics, I find that if leadership, there is a conflict, how do we accommodate each other to make sure that we collaborate to build one thing? As an example, right now, as I sit here, South Africa needs to take a lead in Africa. We are industrialized, we have infrastructure, we've got a great country. And my question is, Why do we waste time on other things that don't matter? I know there are things like corruption and the like that sort of deter us as we are on this road. But if our leadership was coordinated and they collaborate and they work together, we will build a formidable economy. I don't think China, Singapore, South Korea, the US will forget about us.
All right, thank you very much for that. Then we've got another question. How did Booker T. Washington's diligence help him to achieve his goals of getting an education?
Well, here's a young man who comes as a slave. He grows up, he goes to Hampton, he gets an education driven by one word, dedication. And he goes through the process of ensuring that Booker T. Washington didn't have a father. He knew of his father, but he never played that prominent a role in his life. And a lot of people, and funny enough, I reflect on Barack Obama as an example, and I'll come to that later. Booker T. Washington's parents, or people who supported him, they probably didn't have the money to help him at the time. But it was the resilience, it was the dedication, it was the spirit in him to achieve. What do you do with a young man like that at the age of 25 and you say you're going to be the head of this institute? What do you see in that young man? What have you seen? I mean, in South Africa, probably you'd be told that you need experience, still wet behind your ears. And here's a man who turned it into a success. So for me, I think the dedication, the perseverance, and the spirit, the can-do spirit that he had, and that I'm dreaming about for our young people in South Africa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Then I'm going to bring two questions together. And these are questions around the idea of the little things, washing yourself, brushing your hair, polishing your shoes. What positive role do these virtues play in civil society, particularly in the age of the selfie, the online world?
Well, the important thing for me is, these great little things. I know I've had a debate in my office here with a lot of people who are saying, should we come to the office wearing a suit and a tie? No, we don't want a suit and a tie. I'm not wearing a suit and a tie. But for me, if you hygienic, you dressed, you washed, you took a bath or a shower in the morning, probably in 1901, there were no showers. That is why I talk about bathing. Number two, if you brush your teeth, young men will tell you today that girls will laugh at you because something is wrong with your teeth. Am I wrong? If you didn't brush your teeth and the like. In fact, men today are looking after their teeth. There are a lot of cosmetic things that we do. Number three, when you are presentable, you go and present something, you're bound to look for an expensive type of attire, a suit or something else. And I'm not straitjacketing people. I'm not confining people to wearing a suit and a tie. But for a selfie, the world we're living in, be presentable. You take a selfie, you go and present yourself, you are on media, you are on YouTube. People must be able to say, we're talking to a presentable human being.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to change track now to a different question. What can university leaders learn from the work of Booker T and Teke Institute that he headed?
One of the lessons I learned is I'd love to own my own institute. When I read this book, I said to myself, why are you failing to build your own institute in the township, a leadership institute in my township in Guatemala to produce leaders or to have MBAs? And you must remember, Booker T didn't have the money. There's a story where he says, the little dollar that we get in donations or the monies that he was receiving from wealthy people to pay for your education, he told the learners that you are not paying enough. You are not paying enough to run this institute. Your money, your support comes from other people. So the leaders of today who are running universities and institutions, Prof. Marwala, listen to me. Would you on Sunday evening take your evening to spend an hour and address the whole university every Sunday evening, teach them, give them lessons of life? Number one, no, You're not accessible, you're not available. It's a joke, Prof. But it's a good example. We need to be accessible as leaders, number 2. Number 3 for me is we need to throw resources at education. You know, if there's one thing that's an equalizer in this world, this book, Booker T. Washington, it has showed. If you read about W.E.B. Du Bois, you can see that he came from a decent family, the family that educated him probably. Booker T. Washington didn't have anything. We must stop playing victim and look for opportunities. And I know it's not easy because there are rocks ahead.
Great, thank you very much for that. Now we have a question around the virtue of simplicity. Mr. Teke, can we talk about simplicity in language? At university, a lot of material is written complexly. How can we apply simplicity to the academic world?
I'm trying to do a PhD, Prof. Prof. Marwala will tell you, and every time I present a topic to Prof. Marwala and say, Prof. Marwala, would this topic work as a PhD? I have to change one word or two words, that change this one, put it there, and like I understand what this question is all about. Simplicity for me, I think it starts with basic things. Simplicity starts with basic things like, how do we access the university? How do we gain access to the university? How do I go to the library? How do I make it simpler for myself to walk in at the university and just find things easier for me? Number 1. Number 2, how do I make life easier, me? How do I create simplicity around not complicating the life of the university? Number 3, maybe it's a classical way of people to show off that they speak a better language by complicating things. But I find the more we preach about simplicity, I'll give you an example in business. I always say in the office, if people sit in one office, they send each other emails. That's very complex because then the next person responds. Then the next person responds, and suddenly you have people who are copied. Why don't you stand up from your desk, walk to the next person, probably he's 3 or 4 down, the office is down the road, and say, this is what I want to talk to you about. Is that not simple? And people start to say, yes, it's simple. But guess what? I want to complicate it because I want a record. Then you have a complicated life because you must record this email you've written somewhere. Then you must print it because somebody wants it in hard copy. Then somebody would say, why don't you copy my dog in this email? We create complexity ourselves. And I preach the language of just simplify your life. And that's what Booker T. Washington talked about, the virtue of simplicity. Stretch that dollar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Teke. For all of those in the library, I'm sure they are smiling because this has been a big part of what we've tried to do in the library, is how to make things simple. And so we've come up with a very simple mission statement to empower users to find relevant information easily. And it must be one of the simplest mission statements for libraries in the world. We're very proud of it, and we're trying to make access to the library as simple as possible.
Do you think maybe not having a mission statement is simplicity?
Yeah, that's true too. Now I've got another question that's very different. I think it's a student who says, what happens when the people in the village that you go back to look up to you because they're expecting so much from you?
That's the point. They must look up to you. The point is, I'm saying, don't look down upon them. Don't call them, don't look down upon them as if they are ignorant or stupid. Treat them with respect. That's what she's talking about, that don't feel ashamed or don't look down upon them as if they are nothing. When you go back to your neighborhood, when you go back to your village, that's what I'm inculcating. That's what Booker T. Washington talks about, that go back and be seen as that example, as that shining light, that this is our boy. I'm sure we know in African culture, we say that a village educated, you're educated by your village.
Right, then another question, what is the one thing that young aspiring leaders in South Africa can learn from Booker T. Washington?
One lesson we can all learn is to be rational, is to be reasonable, is to be accommodating. They called him an accommodationist because they believed that at the time, when I say they, I'm talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. They felt that he was too accommodating to the white race. I believe in South Africa, young people, to be successful, I never had that trait when I grew up. I have grown up to learn such things where you say, when people make you angry or when things become difficult, when there are rocks ahead, how do you step back and say, I will overcome, instead of starting to fight about it and throw your toys out of the court? I believe it's the time that we teach young people, step back, things are not going to be easy. Don't throw your toys out the court. The university is difficult, the studies are difficult. Think about it. How do you help yourself?
Then another question. Mr. Teke, you mentioned Barack Obama, but didn't go on with that thought. Could you tell us more what you think about Barack? And
yeah, you know, I wanted to make an interesting comment about Barack Obama that, you know, there was a time people had an interesting debate in the US to say, first black president. And there was a debate that was saying, yeah, but he was not a black president because he was raised white. You remember Dr. Ben Carson. He said that Dr. Ben Carson was the previous Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Trump, and he's a Republican, obviously. And he raised the issue that, yeah, Barack Obama was not black, he was raised white. And I'm saying, why should leaders spend time on such things? It's energy sapping and it creates complexity. Why didn't you allow the fact that here's a black president, will support him, good for the country, good for the land, for the world, good for humanity. And he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Why don't we look up to that? We tend to look for opportunities to say, let's bring this person down. Yeah, he was raised white, he was not raised black. That was my point earlier.
And I think in his latest book, he actually unpacks these kinds of questions really well. And I think himself tries to rise above it and say, this is just a complication that is detracting. Yeah. I now have another question. This book was written about 120 years ago, and he was talking about living above your means. I thought this was a modern thing. What does Booker say about the poisons of the shadow side?
Poisons of the
shadow side of like living above your means and the shadow side.
He gives an example. He says when he goes to the north, he used to watch these men who would be dressed in certain clothes, and he would find a woman who's wearing an expensive hat, and he's going to a place, and he realized that most of these people, probabilities are that that money is not their own money. He made an example of a young man who organized a wedding for $150 instead of $4. He says, the poison, you get trapped in that. And the person who's asked this question is right, that it's 120 years ago. That is why when I picked up this book and read it, I said to myself, these things are happening today. How many people, I'll give an example. I had a fallout with somebody last week, and listen to this poison. The person has kids at a public school, but he can afford to pay for an expensive German sedan. That's poison. Why don't you spend your money in giving your children best education in the country and stop worrying about driving an expensive car? It's a schedule versus substance. You're living a lie. If you cannot afford to pay for your kids at a private school or the best education, why then can you afford to pay for an installment of a piece of equipment? In 48 months, it will be finished, and you'll have to sell it, and probably you'll be more indebted to the bank and the person and the company that gave you that car, instead of investing in the education of your children so that one day they can look back and say, we had the best education. Because when I look at myself, I run businesses, and I meet people in their boardrooms who will tell you that I was at Michael House, I was at Hilton, I was at this. You look back and say, by the way, I was in Guatemala in Springs, you know? I would really love, I'm not jealous, I'm not envious, but you say it's such a good thing. And what inspires you? You say, I would love my children to go there, I'd love my grandchildren to go there. And that's basically the shadow versus substance.
Thank you very much for that. The last question that I've got on the list here is, Mr. Teke, I like the idea of the difficult days. How does Booker T suggest that we overcome the difficulties that we are facing, particularly at university?
The most important one, it was a question of talking about how do you persevere. He made an example about you arrive at a university, you find that your room is not as great as you thought it would be. It's about stepping back and saying, it's a small thing, I will overcome this. Some of the people laugh about these big, serious things, these little things. They laugh about it's a joke. It's fine. Tomorrow this room will be fine, or I'll clean it and I'll sort it out. You walk into a room, you find that there are no lights or there's no desk. And suddenly you cause an unnecessary commotion. How do you persevere? How do you step back? How do you slow down and say, we will resolve it tomorrow? People like myself, when I grew up at university, I probably would have caused trouble. I probably would have knocked at the warden's room and made noise. I would have written a revolutionary letter and started a strike or something like that. Booker T. Washington talks about these difficulties will happen. Persevere. You are here to learn. Stop worrying about other things.
Mr. Teke, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. And it has been an incredibly inspiring hour that we have spent together. I think we have learned a lot and there is a lot to think with. And thank you so much for choosing such an inspirational book.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your time. And one day, one starfish at a time, we will change quite a number of people and make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Of course we will. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to the next Mr. Teke's reading group books, and I'm sure that it's going to be just as inspirational as the last books have been. Thank you all so much for joining us. And if you would like to share this with your friends, just remember that it's on our Facebook page and on our YouTube video. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.